Okay, hey. So I'm going to talk about taking inspiration from the functional world. So I'm going to start by saying, what am I doing here? So as you've heard, I'm a Rubyist. So I've been working a lot with object-oriented language like Ruby. And eventually, after many, many years, I've become a little bit disappointed with object orientation. So as I said, I'm a Rubyist, practically speaking, because this is my primary language. It's been my primary language for almost 9 years, which is crazy. And eventually, I've fallen in love with functional programming. So how did that happen? So I finished computer science studies. And for about 3 years, I was learning object-oriented languages like Java, C++, Python, all this stuff. Then I got my first job, and I spent almost 10 years, a little bit more even, working with object-oriented languages. So 9 years was with Ruby, and something that I always wanted to achieve was clean code. I've read about clean code. I started reading books, watching talks, and I really wanted to finally write clean code. So, code that is, easy to change, easy to test, that is easy to replace, just clean code, right? And I started learning because I was like, okay, I'm a beginner, so I need to learn more, and then finally, eventually, I will achieve this, right? So I started learning about all the object-oriented patterns, or all the rules, all the principles, the best practices. I've learned about code smells. I've learned about tools that can help me find those code smells, and then all the refactoring techniques to improve my code, test-driven development, mutation testing, everything. But somehow I was still unhappy with my code. So, I was like, what am I doing? Like, so much time, years are passing, and I'm still unhappy. And like, roughly 2-3 years ago, I started shifting slowly towards functional programming while still writing Ruby. So eventually I was like, okay, I see the light at the end of the tunnel. This is great. Hope it's not a train, right? But I'm still learning and feels good, so let's be positive. So this talk is about Ruby, although I'm going to show you some Ruby tools and some Ruby techniques which are inspired by functional programming. And the first thing is very sad, and it's called mutable state. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ruby, so just in case you're not, I'm going to tell you how it works. So Ruby is an object-oriented language, and it's an extreme object-oriented language. It means that everything in Ruby is an object, excluding some syntax like, if, else, for, while, things like that. This is just syntax. Those are not objects. But everything else is an object. So numbers are objects, strings are objects, arrays, hashes, everything objects, right? And all those objects are mutable. All those objects are mutable. And classes in Ruby are objects too. They are an instance of the class. I know. But that's how it works. And classes are mutable, right? So you can take a class in Ruby and change it. Even the built-in ones, like arrays, strings, you can add methods to them. You can remove methods from them, seriously. So we basically have a language which is object-oriented, and literally everything is mutable by default. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle because people are trying to build libraries, and with a system where everything can be changed at any time, it's kind of difficult. So I'm going to show you some simple example of what I'm talking about. So here's a Ruby array with 2 elements. So an array is an object. Those 2 strings are objects as well. And we do have a way of making something immutable by freezing it. So we have a method called freeze, which is available for all the objects. And after we made this array frozen, and we try to add something to it, we're going to get an exception. So this is good, and we're like, okay, yeah, it's immutable. But then we can do this. We can take the first element, use uppercase with the exclamation mark method, and when we check the array again, it's going to be changed. So that's kind of confusing, right? Like we say freeze it, and then we can change it. So it makes no sense. And some people within the Ruby community started seeing this as a huge problem. It is a huge problem because even though we have conventions like this uppercase method with the exclamation mark, it says this is a dangerous method. It's going to mutate the string. And we do have this convention that is built into the language because we have lots of methods like that with the exclamation mark. However, some pretty popular Ruby libraries like Raise framework, which you might have heard of, introduced a new convention, which is when a method ends with an exclamation mark, it means that it may raise an error. So now we have it's either dangerous, or it's going to raise an error, or it's going to mutate, or raise a blah. You just don't know because we've lost this convention. So it's not really obvious to just look at the method and say, OK, it's dangerous, it's going to mutate something. You just don't know that. And it's a real problem, especially when you're learning Ruby, because there are methods that don't have exclamation mark and they mutate the object, which is just absolutely nuts because you might think that, OK, it doesn't have the exclamation mark, so it's safe, but it's not. And when you learn Ruby, I still remember this from my early days. I was constantly finding code with stupid side effects, some bugs caused by that, and I couldn't realize that, OK, I used some method that actually mutated something. So it is a problem in Ruby, a big problem. And some people try to solve it. There is a library in Ruby called Iceline. It's a third-party gem, so you need to manually install it. And you can use it to deeply freeze an object. So if we have our array with those two elements, those two strings, we can use Iceline, so deep freeze the array, and it's going to deeply freeze it, which means that it's going to freeze the array and go through all the elements and deeply freeze them. So if those strings are arrays, it's going to just deeply recursively freeze it. So the end result is that if we try to mutate the same thing as in the previous slide, we're going to get an exception because now everything is frozen. So that was one attempt of fixing it. But what about our own objects? Because in Ruby, you can't just use the built-in classes and objects. You obviously want to define your own classes. So let's say we have something like this. A post with some tags. We initialize it with an array of tags, and this is the same kind of a problem, right? Because you can create this object, and then some stupid code will mutate some of its, elements, so it's going to be mutated. So if you want to get rid of this, you can install a gem called Adamantium, which uses Iceline under the hood. So you just include Adamantium, cool name, right? And when you try to do the same thing, you're going to get an exception because the object is actually immutable. It's deeply frozen. Its entire internal state is frozen. So that's great. And you might think that, OK, we solved the problem. Unfortunately, there's a drawback. So if we have those two classes, one is going to create mutable objects. The other one, frozen posts, will be immutable, truly immutable. If we run a simple benchmark that only checks the object instantiation, if you take a look at the results, it's just terrible. It's 13 times slower to create an object and deeply freeze it in this really simple case, which means that Ruby isn't really optimized for freezing things. It's just some feature that we happen to have, but it's not really sane to use it, especially in bigger production environments. However, you might be wondering, how is that useful? If it's so slow, it makes no sense. But personally, I found it to be useful for education purposes. Because once you're used to a language where everything is mutable and you're just creating objects that change all the time, it's difficult to unlearn it, right? And the only way in Ruby to actually learn it, to get into this mindset where you're creating objects that won't change, is to enforce it. So those libraries are actually pretty useful for that. So I started using it just to teach myself how to design my libraries, how to design my systems, so that I will be using objects that won't have to change. So that was the first part about mutable state. This was clearly inspired by some functional languages with immutable data structures, which are absolutely awesome. We don't have them because we don't have data structures. We have objects. You need to have objects to represent data. So when you want to have immutable data, you need to have immutable objects in Ruby. So the second part I want to talk about is transforming data. This is one of my favorite subjects, actually. I used to work on an ORM in Ruby called Data Mapper. So I spent a lot of time working on one of its components that was specifically responsible for taking data from a database and just transforming it to some other representation, which in case of Ruby is just mapping objects because we have only objects. So after that, I started a new project because I wanted to get rid of the whole object relational mapping concept, and I wanted to have something that is simpler, something that's more functional and less object-oriented. And also, one of its components is responsible for mapping data because I still need that. So I spent I don't know, 2 years or so experimenting with lots of different approaches. And I ended up realizing that one of the coolest features of Ruby is actually not so cool. And it's called enumerable. It's often listed as one of the greatest strengths of Ruby because it's such an awesome interface that we have available in things like arrays and hashes and sets. It basically gives you an interface to work with the data, to easily map things, reduce things, do all the common stuff. So the way it works in Ruby is that we're dealing with objects, so we obviously have methods. So here's an array, right? An array with 2 elements, just 2 hashes with name and age. And what enumerable gives you is, for example, a method called map, right? It's a very common method. You have lots of different methods coming from enumerable. So map is just one of the examples. I will use just that one to explain to you how it works. And what you see here is a block. And a block actually in Ruby is one of its functional features, because Ruby was actually inspired a little bit also by functional programming. So we do have some functional concepts in Ruby. So this block is kind of like a function because it accepts an argument and is going to return something. And when you call map with this block, the map will simply apply the block to all the elements so that you will get some final result back. So people really like that. This is very idiomatic in Ruby to use blocks. We use a lot of blocks, and people use enumerable a lot in general, not just for arrays, but also for other types of objects. And people actually think it's absolutely great. It is convenient, I gotta say. It's pretty common to use it, and I actually like it. But I have some questions, and I couldn't find any answers. For example, how can we reuse the block in the same way? We don't have any common ways built into the language to encapsulate those pieces of logic that we have inside blocks. And I really needed that. I really needed to have a way of just defining some transformations and composing them somehow. And enumerable just doesn't give it to me because it's an interface that is mixed into an object, so I always need to use its methods. So what we can do to kind of encapsulate it is that we can use lambdas. In Ruby, we do have lambdas. As I mentioned, we do have some functional concepts that are built into the language. So this is a lambda that I call prefix. It's going to return, it's going to receive a user hash, and it's going to return a new hash where all the keys are prefixed with user underscore. So this is lambda, and we can just call it, and we can also just pass it to the map method as an argument, right, using this ampersand thingy. And it's going to just turn it into a block, and it's going to work. So that's great. This is like a step into the right direction, right? And you're going to get the same result, right? So I have a couple of issues with this. The first one is when you look at this, simple piece of code, you actually realize that you have 3 things here. The first one is the method. Then we have an object that we need to call this method on. And then we have our lambda. But what we are really interested in is these two things, map and prefix, because that thing is a whole operation, whole transformation that we want to do. And in Ruby, you don't really have a way of composing those 2 things, because map is a method on an object, and prefix is our lambda that we pass to this method. So there's no way to just compose those things together, because one is an argument, the other one is a method. So what we can do in Ruby is to define another method and, I don't know, decorate the array with another object and have some interface that would just encapsulate those 2 things, which could be a solution, but it introduces 2 abstractions instead of 1, so it makes no sense. And what people do in Ruby quite often, which is very sad, is that we're using monkey patching. We're just taking an array and we're just introducing a new method that will just encapsulate 2 things, and we're like, yeah, we're done. It's great. So this is sad, but the Ruby language allows you to do it, so people think it's fantastic. So here's a numerable module. That is, as I mentioned, this comes with the Ruby language. You always have it, and you can just define a new method, and it's going to be available for all your objects, even though it makes no sense in many cases because it actually depends on the state of this object. It requires specific type of objects to work, but they just added it. This is an actual monkey patch that comes with latest Rails. Just crazy. But people like it because it's idiomatic. It's still an object. It's still a method call. It feels just natural to do it like that. And there's another thing which kind of makes it nice for people because you can chain method calls. So if you call this pluck method and it's going to return another array, you will be able to call all other methods that you have available. So this is very typical Ruby code, right? You have pluck and then you have map and you can like chain those things. And it feels good, right? People really like this kind of syntax. But I still have a problem with that, and it's still not flexible enough for me. So the reason for that is that I still lack the composability. I cannot like take those methods and compose them together like functions in functional languages. I still cannot do that. Ruby doesn't allow me to do that. And I really needed that because I was working on a data mapping component, and we basically have like a configuration for the mapping which I need to translate to a transformation function, and I just couldn't do it with plain Ruby. I was just missing features. So what I realized eventually is that I actually have method objects in Ruby. As I mentioned, in Ruby, everything is an object, including methods. So methods defined on modules and classes are also objects, and you can take a reference, get a reference to those method objects. So that was something, and here's an example. Here's a lambda, pluck h, let's call it pluck h. And here is, we can call it, we can call it, you get a result back, very simple. And here is the very same thing defined as a method, right? It's exactly the same logic, but defined as a method in a module, in a Ruby module. And now you can actually ask the mappings module to give you the method object back. So you just say mappings.method and please give me your pluck h method, and it's going to return an object that actually behaves just like the lambda that I showed you before. So you can just call it. So this is actually really nice because in Ruby you can like define a bunch of methods and then take them as objects and do something with them, which is what I did. So how do we compose them? We cannot, because even though there is an idea of having some composition for lambdas and procs and method objects, it's still under discussion. People are actually arguing about how to call it. So maybe they will figure it out. But there is a hope that they will add it eventually. But for now, we don't have that. So I needed to introduce some additional infrastructure around those method objects so that I can finally compose them. So I created a library called transprog, which gives you this small extension. So you extend your module with transprog registry. Then you just define your methods just without any kind of extra stuff. Those are typical methods in Ruby, nothing magical. And then you can access those methods using magical thing, which is this square bracket accessor. So once you get this method back, you actually have more features because it's wrapped in a decorator object. So as you can see, we need to do kind of extra stuff to achieve something like function composition in Ruby. However, it works, so that's good. So let's say we wanted to generalize this method called pluck. So we say it's going to receive a hash and a name of the key that we want to extract, and then just read the value of this under this key. So then we can take a reference to it and say that we're going to call it with h. And this part is actually not so beautiful because like the order of arguments is kind of confusing, but it works. So that's good. And the way you can compose it is pretty simple. If we have, let's say, another method called upcase, which just receives some string and is going to just call upcase on it. So you can do this with those special objects, which is a pipeline composition operator that I introduced. And then I learned about the same thing in Elixir, kind of the same thing. And actually, when people see it, they're like, this is weird. And it is weird. In Ruby, this is not idiomatic. However, it gives you a lot of flexibility, and you can easily compose transformations with that. And actually, some people started using it, which is nice. And after a while, they came back to me and say, you know what? I always hated this kind of task where I have, for example, some, I don't know, HTML that I need to turn into something else and then map it to something else. But now I really like it. It's just easy to compose those small bits of functionality into a single thing and just call it. So that's kind of reassuring that it's not such a horrible idea after all. And there's actually more. Well, forgot to show you how to call it. Yeah, you just call it just like any Lambda in Ruby. We also have a nice feature there, which is kind of extra, a bonus, where you can import other functions into your module from other modules. So here's an example. We can, for example, import this little thing called extract key. Transport actually comes with a bunch of transformation functions by default, just because I needed them. And then you can actually import methods from another library, which is really nice because in Ruby, as an object-oriented language, it's not really easy to integrate two libraries together when it's typical object-oriented mess. And here, since we're just relying on simple methods inside modules that are stateless, which also helps, we can actually reuse functionality from other libraries without a single line of integration code, which is a success, actually. And then, just like I showed you before, you can compose those things together to do some stuff. So this library, even though when I introduced it, some people were really confused, like, why do you even do this? This library is actually used really heavily in another Ruby project called Ruby Object Mapper. And it's the best thing that worked for this project. And I really struggled to do it differently before it. And it's just great. So that was the second section. Now I'm going to talk about monads. However, I don't exactly know what it is, but we do have some libraries in Ruby. We do have some libraries in Ruby that implement some monads. I'm using just one of them. It's the last one in this list. It's called Iceline. And there's just one thing that I learned about this, which was just fantastic for me, is that I can finally easily handle failures in my code, and it's no longer like a spaghetti of conditionals, rescuing from exceptions, and checking nils everywhere. I finally got rid of this, and I'm finally using some consistent interface. So Iceline is a small gem. It actually comes with just a couple of simple things, simple custom objects. So the first one is called maybe, which is really nice because in Ruby we have nil, and those nils are everywhere. And it's actually really hard to deal with them. So typical Ruby code has like a lot of nil checks. And typically, like one of the most common errors in Ruby is that some method was called on nil because you expected a string and suddenly you have a nil. So nils just leak everywhere. So being able to explicitly say that, okay, this can be a nil, but it also can be a real thing, is actually really helpful. You're just more explicit about things. And in this example, I also use either, which is implemented using right and left. So right is for success and left is for failure. And I found this to be really useful. Then you can do more things with it using the exactly same kind of code. So what's nice about it is that I managed to finally remove a lot of conditional logic and use the very same interface to deal with things that can either fail or return some success. So eventually you can do something with the result or handle error somehow. So for me, that was really nice and is definitely inspired by some functional languages. But as I said, I have no idea what monads are. So, but it's nice. So last part is about functional objects. So this is not really strictly related to any specific Ruby library. It's just something that I realized recently. So as I mentioned, for almost 9 years of writing Ruby, I was unhappy with my code for like 7 years. So like 2 months ago, I realized that the way I define my objects is more like I was defining functions than objects. And I finally realized that thanks to this structure, I can finally have objects that are small, that don't do too much, that don't have side effects, that are easy to compose, that are easy to access and easy to reuse. Something that was promised to me like 10 years ago, and I was trying to use all kinds of things, and it never worked. And now I have objects that kind of look like functions, and finally I get all those nice things. So the first thing is that those objects are stateless, which I know sounds confusing because an object is basically something that has a state. However, I made a distinction that I'm not going to use objects where I have state using data. So I just don't want to mix data with behavior, which is kind of fundamental object orientation, right? You mix data with behavior, like encapsulate data, you hide the data, and data is just not visible. I just got rid of this concept. I was like, this makes no sense. Like objects that are encapsulating data are just not reusable. They are just difficult. They have side effects. I don't want to have this. So, but I still use objects. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Since Ruby is an object-oriented language, it means that it's object-oriented language. So I want to use objects because it's optimized for objects. And it's easy to work with objects. It's easier to work with objects than to use, for example, stateless modules. Because people are asking me, like, why do you need objects? If you hate mutable state, if you hate state in general, like, why don't you just use modules? Modules have no state. And it's not really true, because in Ruby, everything is an object in modules. I know it's confusing, but just bear with me. Moduling classes are also objects, and they are global objects, and they are global mutable objects, and they actually can have states. So it's just absolutely nonsense to use them. So I decided to just get rid of them and focus purely on objects, because I want to have objects with dependencies, because that's how you do it. You cannot reuse some functionality from another place of your system if you don't have access to other objects. So I need this state, right? I need dependencies as part of the object state. So next thing is that they don't change. But as I mentioned, I'm no longer using those libraries that do those crazy deep freezing thing because it's too slow. But I learned to design those objects in a way that they won't have to change. They will just work. I will just instantiate them, and they will do everything they need to do, and nothing will have to change them so that they can work. Because this is very typical in Ruby, that you just create an object, you have an instance, and you cannot like call all the methods, because currently, this object state is not good enough for some method to work. So you have like dependency in the order in which you call methods. It's crazy, but people are used to it, which is even more crazy. But yeah, object orientation. So the next thing about those objects is that I decided to use really consistently method call, because it's a convention in Ruby. Lambdas, procs, method objects, they all respond to call. This is the only way to call a proc, to call a lambda in Ruby. So I decided to also just embrace this and decided to use method call, which has some nice benefits. Like, for example, I can do something with a lambda and then replace it with my own object for whatever reason. And it's going to work because in Ruby we have DAG typing. So basically it's the same interface. So you can just swap something with your own object and it's going to continue to work. So that's nice. And the next part is that the call method always receives some input and always returns some output. So as I mentioned, I don't use state in those objects to like accumulate some data so that I can do something with the data. I just don't do that. So instead, typically data also represented by an object is just passed into the call method, which comes with so many benefits. The first one is that, and obviously I don't have any side effects, so I never ever mutate the input. So there are lots of benefits here, and the first one, probably the biggest one, is that it's so simple to compose objects together. So in object orientation, we have this thing, you've probably heard about this, that you should always prefer composition over inheritance. And I'm actually not sure if Ruby people will understand what it means, because we use inheritance so much in Ruby. Like modules are so often used, and modules are just multiple inheritance. Lots of libraries come with some base classes that you inherit from, which is also inheritance, obviously. But composition in Ruby is pretty simple. You just have a constructor and you pass in some dependencies, and there you go. You have two objects imposed, right? And when you have a design like that, when an object just responds to call, and it receives something and returns something, it's just easy to like create like some kind of computational pipeline, or just get some initial input, and through some processing using multiple objects, you get some final result back. Whereas in typical object orientation world, you would have like lots of different abstractions, lots of different classes, different interface names, different kind of behavior. Like some objects would encapsulate data, some other objects would be like utility objects that would not have state. Some objects would have side effects, others would not. And it's just impossible to even mentally grasp it, not to mention like really, reuse certain parts of your system, because it's just messy. So there's unfortunately one drawback, because as I mentioned, I'm using objects. So to have an object, I need to instantiate it. This is kind of specific to object orientation, object-oriented languages. And the reason why I still want to use objects is that I have dependencies, so I want to inject them. So I started looking at how it's done in all languages, and I've obviously learned about things like dependency injection and version control, all this stuff, which is actually pretty complicated in some languages like Java or .NET. In Ruby, people, whenever they hear dependency injection, they're like, "Oh, just run away. I don't want to talk to you." Like seriously, they just think it's just gross. It's just completely horrible. And actually, when I look at some attempts of implementing this, I kind of understand why they think like that, because it can be really crazy complicated. However, I started using something that is very, very simple so that I can easily organize my code, which was also one of my personal pet peeves. Like, I don't know how to organize my code. Like, where do I instantiate objects? What methods do I use to instantiate objects? It's just like scattered across my whole code base. It's messy. I hate it. And finally, I decided, okay, I'm going to use a container. Okay, I know people hate it, whatever, I'm going to use it. So we have a small library in Ruby called dry container, which is trivial. It's just an object that you can use to register your objects. So I do this. I have a container in my app that is accessible from everywhere. It's pretty much global, but it's okay. And you just register your objects, and you have just one place where you just define all your things. This is obviously some boilerplate code. When people see it, they hate it, but you need that anyway. Like, even if you didn't use a container, you would have all this instantiation logic scattered across entire code base, probably without any consistency. So I decided to use it anyway because it's just in one place, it's well-defined, it has a structure, and actually I could even like write some code that would like take my directory structure with file naming conventions and just generate all those things automatically. Ruby definitely would allow me to do that. So I could even get rid of this. However, I like it because it's explicit. So the second part is that I need some way of injecting dependencies. And as I mentioned, when people hear dependency injection in Ruby, they are just afraid of it. I don't know why, actually, because it's just so simple. So this small library, dry auto inject, it allows you to define a module that will be specifically configured for your container so that you can easily import your objects into other objects whenever you want to do that. Which means that in your entire application, you don't need to bother at all with object instantiation. You just ask, hey, container, give me this. Or, hey, import module, give me this here. And it's going to just work. You just never, ever bother about how to instantiate something, what arguments does it support, should I pass dependency, should I pass some data. You just don't care. You just give me this, and then you can use it. So this is an example of a typical class that I define these days. As you can see, I call it persist user, so it's not user persister or user creator or, God forbid, user manager. And it's just including its dependencies. So it's like include, import, give me database, and validate user. I just made it up. It's actually no real code, but kind of explains the concept. So basically, every time I need some other object as a dependency in this object, I just use this import thing, and it's going to just work. Then I just define this call method, which, as I mentioned, receives input, and it's going to return some output. I'm using this Clasley gem that I showed, so it's like input, fmap, and then left errors, right are success, so that's great. And what I realized with those objects is that, when using those objects, is that it's so easy to refactor them. Which is also very valuable. Like in an object-oriented world, we have all those discussions like, okay, does this object follow single responsibility principle, or should I inject dependency or not? Should I call this method create user or sign up user? I just don't have this kind of discussions. I just do this, and it's like automatically by default, it's following all those good principles in object-oriented world. And one thing that I really love about this is that I can finally reuse my code, which never ever happened before. Like I could never, like, for example, start a console of my application and just say, okay, now I'm gonna create a user and with like all the surrounding logic that is required. I could never ever do that easily in any other app before I started using this technique. So right now, I'm finally happy because I can start a console, and I have access to like every little piece of functionality in my application, and it's always very simple. But what made me really laugh was like, I looked at this at some point like a few months ago. It's like, this feels more like a function, not like an object. So I really need to switch languages. But yeah, the difficult question, does it make any sense? Like I showed you some stuff. Some things are a little bit confusing to discuss because we're talking about an object-oriented language, and some things are functional. They kind of look like in other languages, but not really. We have objects everywhere, mutable state everywhere, so it's difficult to deal with this. So it doesn't make any sense. And it's obviously a difficult question. So the short answer is yes, but I should probably elaborate a little bit. So it makes sense. It makes sense because we have a ton of Ruby code and code written in different object-oriented languages out there. More code will be written, more code is being written, whether we like it or not. And I think that we don't really need any more reasons to understand that there are a lot of concepts in object-oriented world that are just, they just make no sense these days, especially when it comes to mutable state. People are so used to using mutable objects, I just cannot get it. That's why I think that we should really keep exploring. Like I was doing a lot of experimentation with Ruby, and it wasn't easy. Like I was experimenting with some stuff, I was showing it to some people, and I would get a lot of really negative feedback. Like, people like just go to functional world, like just stop with this weird stuff. But I just cannot help myself because it works so well for me. Like not in my toy projects, in my real projects, things deployed to production. So I really want to keep discussing it and trying to inspire more people to also try this out because it just makes sense. Furthermore, I think that with such initiatives, we can actually change the direction of some languages because in Ruby, we actually do have discussions about certain new features that could help with some functional concepts, like this Prague, Lambda composition operator that I mentioned. They are discussing it, so there's hope. We could also have things like better support, like native support for immutable objects. I would love to be able to say, I'm going to define a class, but instances of this class cannot be changed, and I want my language to be able to enforce this. So object-oriented languages are here to stay. I mean, whether we like it or not, they will live for some time. And I just think that we just need to find a way of improving our code, even though we are using object-oriented languages. Like personally, I'm trying to learn functional languages. I will definitely, at some point, switch to a functional language as my primary language. But I will definitely, help lots of clients with Ruby for a few years at least. So I just, I think it makes sense to inspire people to try to find new ways of writing code, even though it's still object-oriented world. So yeah, that was it. Thanks for listening. This is me. My name is Piotr Solnica. I'm a software consultant. I'm a Ruby expert. I blog a little bit from time to time on solning.eu. Typically, I write about Ruby, although we're going to see much more about functional languages as I learn them. Right now, I'm learning Elixir, so we're going to read about Elixir there. You can follow me on Twitter. I typically tweet about programming. I love to use Twitter to interact with other programmers, so I'm not going to, post pictures of my sandwiches or something. So you can follow me. You can find my stuff on GitHub. I'm Solnik on GitHub. I'm pretty active in Ruby open source world. And yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
We have time for questions. No questions? Any Rubies? Any offended Rubies? Any happy Rubies?
I hope there are no Rubies here, seriously.
Maybe just some hints about the Elixir language. How, given your current experience with Elixir, what are the main differences of this language? It being based in the OTP airline, and not being pure as well. Just a few words for that.
Yeah, so Elixir was created by Joseph Alim. He used to work a lot with Ruby. He is, I think, still part of the Ruby on Rails core team. So he created the language mostly because he was frustrated with how concurrency works in Ruby, or how it doesn't work. So he created a new language. And what's really nice about Elixir is just that it feels so nice to learn. And I know it may sound silly, but I think it's an important factor that it should be easy to learn a language. And Elixir feels kind of like Ruby because it has a syntax that is inspired by Ruby, but it's a functional language. So you have functions, you have all those nice things like immutable data structures, and it's based on Erlang VM, so it has a really solid foundation. And it has a really, really nice community. A lot of people are moving from Ruby to Elixir. And yeah, I just started learning it. And my experience so far, I did a little bit, but what made me really happy was that I could just, grab a book about it, just, quickly go through some sections. And there we go, I write Elixir code. See, 9 years, just, whew. I wrote Elixir code, and I managed to write some tests and made them pass, and it just worked, and it felt great. So, yeah, but that's just my initial kind of, experience. I still, didn't have a chance to write any real-world Elixir code. But yeah, I think the learning curve is absolutely, fantastic with Elixir. For example, I tried to learn Haskell. I'm still trying to learn Haskell. And it's just so hard for me. It's just insanely hard for me. Like I'm 32, working full time, 2 kids, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna learn Haskell. And the first thing that I see, go and finish this CS course. I'm like, what? Like, show me how to do things. Like in an hour, I may write real crappy code, but I want to see something that works, right? So it was really hard. With Elixir, it's not like that. But Elixir is not as different as Haskell. It's dynamically typed. That's the biggest difference probably. But still, learning curve with Elixir is just absolutely great. I think it's a great improvement over Ruby. So like if people are writing Ruby and would like to improve and then switch to functional language, Elixir is probably the best choice these days. What else? Yeah, I think that's it.
So,
Thanks.